Merci beaucoup pour donner l'opportunité pour faire notre présentation. Nous pouvons partager certains aspects de notre recherche précédente qui sont pertinents de ce projet à retour au travail. Désolé, nous avons fait notre présentation en anglais. Sorry about that. And we'll do our best beyond that in discussion to answer questions from French and English. So both Janet and I work together at Wilfrid Laurier University in different areas, but also together through the International Migration Research Center. We intend to discuss with you some of the work we've done over, roughly the last 15 years, with an emphasis on the realities of workers in agriculture, but also hopefully laying out what we are planning to do and what we started to do with this new phase of research on return to work. So we've had a decade, or actually more now, at least me anyway. 2 decades, but who's counting? Of research, quantitative and qualitative, some of it together, some of it separate, with migrant agricultural workers. We've now gone beyond and are looking at other sectors. I've done a lot of comparative work in other countries, and we bring that material and thinking to our analysis. Some specific projects that have been funded that are relevant, some of which are listed here. And we've created a hub, which might be of interest to people, a resource hub for migrant worker health information through migrantworkerhealth.ca. Much of our work has involved collaboration with medical practitioners as well, and they've helped us in designing our instruments, for example, as we've carried out our work. So isn't this great? It's like impossible to read. It's on purpose. This reflects the complexity of the temporary foreign worker program in Canada. This reflects multiple categories and streams. It reflects the situation that you have some that are required to have, where employers have to have labor market opinion or LMIA systems so that they have to get permission to hire migrant workers. And what this means and how this translates out is that you have sometimes in the same workplace multiple people under multiple programs that have very different relationships to the employer and capacities to be able to claim rights. And the way in which their rights are structured and their workplace realities are structured impedes often in different ways their ability to access health care, to have safe workplaces, and to access compensation. The policy context in agriculture has a long history. In 1966, the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program was developed between Mexico and the Caribbean, actually Caribbean first, then Mexico in 73. And there are now over roughly 50,000 agricultural migrant workers in Canada, with 40,000 coming in just through that program. We have the SOP being relatively unchanged in this more than 50-year history. What we do have is a situation that it's a cyclical and a circular or a seasonal migration program where people will come repetitively for 8 months at a time, year after year, and there's a naming system that allows employers to request workers to come back year after year. This all structures their experiences in the program. In the other program, we have in another program stream in agriculture. It's opened up. It's all countries of origin, and they can come for broader periods of time. What they both have in common is workers under these streams of the temporary foreign worker program are highly precarious workers with limited to no access to permanent residency, very limited access and uneven access to collective bargaining, etc. Some new policy changes have emerged in the face of a number of relatively public, large-scale media attention around abuses and exploitation in these programs that are well documented. And some of these policy changes have been at the provincial level. So the other level of hierarchy that makes things even more complicated is the jurisdictional stuff that Catherine pointed to earlier, which is there are provincial nominee programs that might create opportunities for some migrant workers to be able to access permanent residency, and in some provinces and not others, for example. And this backdrop, I think, further adds to that level of complexity for us to be able to tackle it and understand what's happening in each of these cases. Some of the new changes have meant that at the Ontario level, there's some access to permanent residency for agricultural migrant workers under both of these streams, but as of yet, it's not been accessed. At the federal level, there's a pilot project for northern and rural areas, but for SOP, it's still out of reach. By way of another important piece of backdrop is that migrant workers represent a really significant proportion of the workforce in agriculture, and even more so with respect to harvesters and general laborers. And by also from a gender perspective, 97% are male, so that leaves only 3% women. So even though we've had a growth over time in these programs of the numbers of migrant workers coming, that has remained relatively constant, that sort of gender representation. And this actually doesn't reflect what's happening among domestic or national workers, because we know that roughly 13% of the agricultural workforce is women if we're looking at the domestic workforce or the national workforce. So it doesn't match up. There's been claims of gender discrimination there. In fact, there are human rights cases happening around that in Mexico. Our projects, previous projects we've done, we're going to highlight really just one here today, involved 100 interviews with sick and injured workers. We identified 30 case studies out of those workers. We did really in-depth follow-on multiple interviews documenting those cases and understanding the experiences of accessing or the experiences of injured workers in that context. We also identified, and these are the main health issues that were in those case studies, and I think it's interesting to note that these kind of broadly reflect some of the more aggregate data we've looked at as well about types of injuries and illnesses in the workplace. We previously did a study of 600 migrant agricultural farm workers, and this kind of matches onto that nicely. So it is somewhat representative, but also you can see that the areas that people were not applying were in those kind of more chronic areas that are difficult to demonstrate. And then in some kinds, those where workers had already returned to countries of origin and those symptoms present much later. Okay, so overall, these are some of the issues we've encountered. I think some of them have already been covered, and they're going to come out in Janet's continued part of this presentation. And just maybe to point to some more specific ones here, from a worker perspective, under the SOP, quite often, if workers are injured or for any reason choose not to work, the employer has the capacity under the program to return them to their countries of origin. And so that's another really important factor that leads to an additional kind of barrier to accessing workplace safety insurance, and has all sorts of consequences for return to work. And from employers, the experience rating affecting their premiums is something that's a factor that also leads to a lack of reporting. I'll leave it there and turn it over to Janet to continue our presentation.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to be highlighting some of the qualitative features of our research. But before I get into that, one of the main issues in underreporting is migrant workers not being informed about their rights to workers' compensation. So in our sample, and remember this is all workers with illnesses and injuries, 65% weren't aware about the workers' compensation system when we asked them this. And of the 35% who were aware, when we asked if they understood it, only 28% said yes. So basically, this means that less than 10% of our sample of injured and ill migrant workers knew and understood the workers' compensation process. So this is one of the reasons reports don't get made to begin with. And I just want to highlight a few quotes that explain this in more detail. So one of the first issues, as Jenna noted in our case studies, what we found is that issues, for example, of kidney failure or of cancers among pesticide applicators who may have been wondering if their exposures to chemicals led to their illnesses, these types of cases tended to not be made, and the issue is here a cause and effect. So the people we interviewed said basically if there was a very clear cause and effect, so a worker fell off a tractor and severed their whatever or banged their head, then they would be applied for workers' compensation when they went to the ER. But if there was any kind of chronic issue or issue that wasn't clear-cut, even if it was something like back pain that wasn't acute but rather emerged over time, these issues tended to not get filed for compensation. And the physicians we interviewed acknowledged this as well. And they even said, you know, the workers themselves don't want to have anything to do with WSIB because they don't want to risk their employment. So when they were asked why they didn't file, some physicians weren't aware of their rights, but others said, we're aware, but the workers don't want us to file. And then this came out again with our interviews with workers and also with government officials. This Mexican government official said, the workers don't speak because they're afraid of repatriation and being tagged as conflictive workers. So even the government officials involved with the program acknowledge this as an issue. And then Jenna already touched on employers' concerns over rising premiums. So our research identified a host of issues with respect to return to work and repatriation. The first is that there's a lack of housing and transportation support for workers when they're injured. They tend to have to rely on their employers, and their employers tend to want them to leave and free up that spot for a worker who's more fully able to return to productive work. Another issue identified is that the correspondence from the board was often sent to the consulate, sometimes delayed in reaching workers. And again, we've heard about the language being an issue here for non-English speaking workers unable to understand some of their correspondence. The idea that employers under the seasonal agricultural worker program can fire their worker, which then leads to their repatriation, means that many other rights are simply unattainable. And I'll go through this in more detail in just a moment. There's also the naming system that Jenna spoke about, where employers can request certain workers to come back, and the fact that workers want to please their employers in order to secure future employment. We had many injured workers repatriated before their conditions could be fully investigated or treated, and then they're sent back to their home countries where they lack health insurance. And we also had the experience where workers' own consulate officials, who are supposed to be representing their rights, and pressured injured workers to return home quickly. So I want to highlight this issue of consulate officials who are workers' countries' representatives who are supposed to help mediate their access to rights. But the issue here is that there's basically a real mistrust of consulates towards community legal groups and community groups that want to support migrant workers. So some of these quotes exemplify that. For example, this legal worker said that the consulate opposes the right out of the bat because they don't want anyone helping their workers. So basically, even when community legal workers are making their services available for free and they have expertise in this area, the consulate is threatening workers not to use those services. And the worker in the second quote is talking about how the people at the consulate told them that if they stayed in Canada and accessed these support services, that they would lose all of their rights, that they would not be coming back in the program, and they would lose all access to benefits. So basically, even though these supports could be available, the workers are being threatened not to use them. So on a broader level, why does the return to work system fail migrant agricultural workers? Well, really the structure of the seasonal agricultural worker program itself is to blame in many cases, because Canadian employers can state that they don't have work for these workers, and then the worker can be repatriated. They can do this whether the worker is injured or not injured, and this is their right under the contract of the program. In other cases, what we've found is that doctors may advise that the workers can return to work doing modified tasks. And I should mention that this is difficult in agriculture, which is a very labor-intensive, heavy industry. So often there are not easily identified modified tasks. But when the worker disputes this and says that the tasks are causing them further injury, then the employer can say that they've breached their contract and fire them. And we've encountered this many times. So there's no appeals or monitoring process, and then firing normally results in workers' repatriation. And because of this, any workers' rights that they do have are practically inoperable. So this legal worker sums up this really clearly. They're trying to fit the Act, the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act, to cover the migrant workers whose situations are totally different than domestic workers. And another quote from a WSIB representative, and I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to highlight the key parts here. They say the employer wants the worker to be repatriated, and then there are no reemployment obligations. The return to work obligations don't apply because the seasonal agricultural worker program agreement that they have with the federal government, which supersedes our act. So saying there's really nothing we can do about that because this supersedes our act. Many quotes about the pressure to repatriate workers right away. Employers reiterated that they should be able to just go home and get treated there. Why should they stay on my property receiving support here in Canada? And this WSIB representative in the first quote, again, really candidly said, there are a lot of situations where they get repatriated, particularly where there are permanent impairments because the farmers want a replacement, their widgets. And this is exactly what happened. They're sent home, a new healthy worker replaces them. So the result of all of this is that injured workers are falling through the cracks between these various agreements. Because they are repatriated, they're sent back home, where there are no retraining and reemployment opportunities for them. Then, as Catherine mentioned earlier, they are deemed as though they could work in an Ontario job in the jurisdiction where they were previously employed. So, for example, they might be deemed to be able to work as a gas bar attendant in Niagara, even though there is no way that they can return to Canada to take up this job. So because they have been deemed as able to work in Niagara, their benefits are cut off, yet there are no income opportunities in their countries of origin. Typically, they lack the formal education or skills for other jobs, so they are unemployable in their countries of origin where only manual labor is an option. And now they're left in a situation where they are unable to work, they are unable to retrain for other jobs, they are unable to return to Canada, and they are unable to qualify for benefits. And the end result of all of this is these multiple layers of loss. So they've not only experienced a physical injury, they've lost their ability and right to return to Canada to work, they've lost all sorts of income. This often results in them losing any kind of housing that they did have. The nutrition of their entire family is suffering because they can no longer even afford food. Of course, this has huge mental and emotional costs for the workers and their families. Many times families split up because of this, so they've lost their identity as a breadwinner, they've often lost their family, and of course their entire quality of life suffers. So we interviewed these case studies over long term and just watched their lives spiral downwards because of these flaws in our system. So I think I'm out of time. So I'm just going to conclude with what we are doing next. So our next project as part of this broader group is to comparatively investigate return to work barriers and facilitators for temporary foreign workers across other streams of the temporary foreign worker program. We now have a pretty good handle of what's happening in agriculture, but we want to understand how these situations intersect across other sectors for men and women. And we also want to propose policy solutions to ensure the optimal return to work for all temporary foreign workers. So thanks very much.